The tipping point, how little things can make a big difference. Malcolm Gladwell. The law of the few. 10. The question of what makes someone or something persuasive is a lot less straightforward than it seems. We know it when we see it, but just what it is not always obvious. Consider following two examples, both drawn from the psychological literature. The first is an experiment that took place during the 1984 presidential campaign between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mandel. For 8 days before the election, a group of psychologists led by Brian Mullen of Syracuse University videotaped the 13th national nightly news program, which then, as now, were anchored by Peter Jennings at ABC, Tom Brokaw at NBC, and Dan Rather at CBS. Mullen examined the tapes and exported all reference to the candidate until he had 37 separate segments, which roughly 2.5 seconds long. Those segments were then shown with the sound turned off to a group of randomly chosen people who were asked to rate the facial expression of each news cast in which segment. The subject had no idea what kind of experiment they were involved with or what the newscasters were talking about. They were simply asked to score the emotional content of the expression of these three men on 21-point scale, with the lowest being extremely negative and the highest point on the scale extremely positive. The results were fascinating. Dan Rather scored 10.46, which translates to an almost perfectly neutral expression. When he talked about Mondale, then 10.37, which he talked about Reagan. When he talked about Reagan, he looked the same when he talked about Republican as he did when he talked about Democrat. The same was true for Brokaw, who scored 11.21 for Mondale and 11.50 for Reagan. But Peter Jennings of ABC was much different. For Mondale, he scored 13.38, but when he talked about Reagan, his pace lit up so much he scored 17.44. Mullen and his colleague went out of their way to try to come up with an innocent explanation for this. Could it be, for example, that Jennings is just more expressive in general than his colleague? The answer seemed to be no. The subjects were able to show control segment of the three newscasters as they talked about vocally happy or sad subject. The funeral of Indira Gandhi, a breakthrough in treating cognition disease. But Jennings didn't score any higher on the happy subject or lower on the sad subject than his counterpart. In fact, if anything, he seemed to be the least expressive of the three. It also isn't the case that Jennings is simply someone who has a happy expression of his face all the time. Again, the opposite seemed to be true. On the happy segment inserted for comparison purpose, he scored 14.13, which was substantially lower than both Rader than Brocco. The only possible conclusion, according to the study, is that Jennings exhibited a significant and noticeable bias in facial expression toward Reagan. Now, here is where the study gets interesting. Mullen and his colleague then called up people in a number of cities around the country who regularly watch the evening network news and asked them who they voted for. In every case, those who watched ABC voted for Reagan in far greater numbers than those who watched CBS or NBC. In Cleveland, for example, 75% of ABC watchers voted Republican versus 79.9% of CBS or NBC viewers. In Williamstown, Massachusetts, ABC viewers were 71.4% for Reagan versus 50% for the other two networks. In Erie, Pennsylvania, the difference was 73.7% to 50%. The subtle pro-Reagan bias in Jennings' case seems to have influenced the voting behavior of ABC viewers. As you can imagine, ABC News disputed this study vigorously. It's my understanding that I'm only a social scientist to have the dubious distinction of being called a jackass by the Peter Jennings, says Mullen. It's hard to believe. Instinctively, I think, most of us would probably assume that the causation run in opposite direction. The Reagan supporters are drawn to ABC because of Jennings' bias, not the other way around. But Mullen argued fairly convincingly that this isn't plausible. For example, on other, more obvious level, like for example, story selection. ABC was shown to be the network most hostile to Reagan, so it's just as easy to imagine hardcore Republicans deserting ABC News for the rival networks, and to answer the question of whether his result was simply a fluke. 4 years later, in the Michael Dukakis, George Bush campaign, Mullen repeated his experiment with the exact same result. Jennings showed more smile when referring to the Republican candidate than the Democrat. Mullen said, and again in a phone survey, viewers to watch ABC were more likely to have voted for Bush. Here is another example of the subtleties of persuasion. A large group of students were recruited for what they were told was a market research study by a company marketing high-tech headphones. They were each given a headset and told that the company wanted to test to see how well they worked when the listener was in motion, dancing up down, or say, or moving his or her head. All of the students listened to songs by Linda Ronstadt and the Eagles, and then heard a radio editorial arguing that tuition and their university would be raised from its present level of $187 to $750. A third were told that while they listened to the tape radio editorial, they should nod their head vigorously up and down. The next third were told to shake their heads from side to side. The final third were the control group. They were told to keep their head still. When they were finished, all the students were given a short questionnaire asking them questions about the quality of the songs and the effect of the shaking. Slipped in at the end was the question the experiment really wanted the answer to. What do you feel would be an appropriate dollar amount the undergrad tuition per year? The answer is that the question is just as difficult to believe that the answer to the newscaster's poll. The students who kept their heads still were unmoved by the editorial. The tuition amount that they guessed was appropriate was 582, or just about where tuition was already. Those who shook their head from side to side as they listened to the editorial, even though they saw they were simply testing headset quality, disagreed strongly with the disposed increase. They wanted tuition fall to average to 467 a year. Those who were told to nod their head up and down, meanwhile, found the editorial very persuasive. They wanted tuition to rise on average to 646. The simple act of moving their heads up and down ostensibly for another reason entirely was sufficient to cause them to recommend a price that would take money out of their own pocket. Somehow nodding, in the end, matters as much as Peter Jennings' smile did in the 1948 election. There are in these two studies, I think, very important clue as to what makes someone like Tom Gao, or for that matter, any of the salesmen in our lives, so effective. The first is the little things can apparently make us much of a difference as big things. In the headphone study, the editorial had no impact on those whose head were still. It wasn't particularly persuasive. But as soon as listeners started nodding, it became very persuasive. In the case of Jennings, Mulan says that someone's subtle signal in favor of one position to another usually don't matter at all, but in the particular unguarded way that people watch the news, a little bias can suddenly go a long way. When people watch the news, they don't intentionally filter bias out or feel they have to argue against the expression of the newscaster. Mulan explains, it's not like someone saying, this is a very good candidate who deserves your vote. This isn't an obvious verbal message that we automatically dig in our heels against. It's much more subtle, and for the reason much more serious, and much harder to insulate ourselves against. The second implication of this study is that non-verbal clues are more important than verbal clues. The subtle circumstances surrounding how we say things may matter more than what we say. Jenny, after all, wasn't injecting all kind of pro-Reagan comment in his newscast. In fact, as I mentioned, ABC was independently observed to have been the most hostile to Reagan, one of the conclusion of the authors of the headphone study, Gary Wells of the University of Alberta and Richard Pitti of the University of Missouri, was that television advertisement would be most effective if the visual display created repetitive vertical movement of the television viewer's head on bouncing ball. Simple physical movement and observation can have a profound effect on how we feel and think. The third, and perhaps the most important, the third implication of this study is that persuasion often works in a way we do not appreciate. It's not smiles and nods are subliminal message. They are strong-worded and on the surface. It's just they are incredibly subtle. If you ask the head nod why they wanted tuition to increase so dramatically, tuition then would come out of their own pocket. None of them would say, because I was nodding my head while listening to the editorial. They'd probably say that it was because they found the editorial particularly insightful and intelligent. They would attribute their attribute to some more obvious, logical cause. Similarly, the ABC viewers who voted for Reagan would never, in 1,000 years, tell you that they voted that way because Peter Jennings smiled every time he mentioned the president. They'd say that it was because they liked Reagan's policy, or they saw he was doing a good job. It would never have occurred to them that they could be persuaded to reach a conclusion by something so arbitrary and seemingly insignificant as a smile or a nod from a newscaster. If you want to understand what makes someone like Tom Gao too persuasive, in other words, you have to look at much more than his obvious eloquence. You need to look at the subtle, the hidden, and the unspoken.